So I've talked about this on the channel before. I always have a working list of the things that I'm going to be making or talking about or covering or whatever, just, with me. And a video for a few days from now, it says shampoo with cat. I don't actually know what that means. And so I'm sure it's going to trigger at some point in my brain what shampoo with cat means. But as for right now, it left me big confused this morning. So that's always a problem anyway, because it's too early in the morning for my brain to actually fully work. And I have to be focusing on not shampoo with cat, because that's not what we're doing today. We're doing another deep dive that does not involve shampoo or cats, and it's going to be awesome. And I'm going to tell you all about it in just a minute. But before I do, hello, I am Mrs. Soap and Clay. Let's make stuff. How's it going, Sudsers? Welcome back to the channel. You are at Soap and Clay, where we make all the soapy things, and you are here for day 113 of 365 days of soap. And today, as I said, we are doing another deep dive. And that deep dive is called The History of Soap and Soap Making. And the reason why I wanted to do this is because soap has a weird, long, storied, lured, dirty history. And I find it fascinating. And so for you watching me, you might find it fascinating too. So that's what we are doing today, because the history of soap, as I said, very dirty, and confusing and really just dirty. And I wanted to talk about it, really. So that's what we will be doing today. Now, one of the reasons why I wanted to do this is because, well, first, with the whole COVID thing going on for the past, year and a half or whatever, soap has been talked about and written about on all manner of publications, WebMD, FDA, whatever, essentially teaching us the proper way to use soap, and that's the right way to get rid of germs. I find that interesting in and of itself. Like, we had to be taught how to use soap in the 21st century. We don't already know this, but actually it kind of turns out that we kind of don't know this. And the reason why we kind of don't know this is because the human population, while they have been capable of making some version of soap for like 6,000 years, they didn't start using soap on a regular basis to cleanse themselves throughout the day, whatever, up until only like 500 years ago. And that's weird. And so that's one of the reasons why I wanted to talk about it, because COVID, but also I wanted to kind of really talk about some of the fun that exists within the lore of soap making, because we've heard a lot of different stories as to how it came to pass and where it's from, and also how clean people kept themselves for those thousands of years. They were practicing a level of hygiene, but it was not using soap. And so I find that fascinating. I want to talk to you about it. I also want to touch on the ingredients that they used to make soap, and when the shift was from like animal fat soaps to vegetable soaps, why it occurred, where it occurred, what the purpose was, how soap was generally made, and when it started becoming mass produced. Ultimately, I really want to talk about how we ended up, for some crazy reason, getting from 6,000 years ago, we learned how to make soap to, and it's kind of an interesting thing that a lot of people didn't like to use, to Soap today is as boring and as natural as breathing. Yet there's this whole ass community in the soap making world that loves it and took it to a really big high art area, high skin loving area, scientific place that we all exist in today. So we're going to start where all good stories start, at the beginning. Now, with something like this, with soap making, unfortunately, finding the beginning is a little bit complicated. From what we know, the earliest documented writings of some form of soap goes back to 2800 BCE in Babylon, which actually essentially describes a soap made with kind of animal fats and drippings and some sort of alkali mixed with ash. Now, that particular soap looked nothing like the soap that we know today, with the bar form and all the beautiful, bright, clean colors and all the jazz. It was a very tar-like substance, didn't smell very good, was more viscous than we would expect, and it wasn't used for cleansing the body. Really, it was used for cleansing textiles, wools, cooking utensils, things like that. Not really for the human body, which kind of makes sense because if you don't have any measurable way to determine the potency of your alkali, a lot of that soap was probably pretty harsh and would cause skin irritation. So it makes sense that they probably weren't using it for their skin, but also just think about how rough and raw those people's hands had to have been, the ones that were cleaning with the soap, their utensils and their textiles. And also this is 2800 BCE, so there was a lot of rough going on. An historical document was discovered called the Ebers Papyrus that dates back to 1550 BCE that describes the process of making soap as well as how to use soap to treat and help certain skin diseases. Now, interestingly, this Ebers Papyrus also contains like 600 or 700 listings of what we would today consider snake oil. Folk magic, very strange things that were suggested or implemented to cure the body of some ailment. And we're talking about extreme things. We're not even talking about like leeching and stuff like that. It's more like if you have, a foot that's about to fall off, go dance under the moon and circle 3 times, and wild stuff for sure. But soap was also included in this papyrus. Now, there are some people who say that it suggests that the Egyptians were using soap on a daily basis to cleanse their bodies, but that's not what the papyrus says. The papyrus does specify that soap is used to cure and help mitigate skin diseases. Not that it was used or even suggested to be used on a regular basis. In the centuries that would follow, we would also come across all manner of other ways that you can use soap that did not include daily use, i.e., use it for 15 days straight and you would be good for like 6 months and you wouldn't get sick. Very specific stuff, but still did not include actual daily use of soap for anything other than cleaning, again, the aforementioned textiles and, your cooking utensils and all of that. Now, as interesting as the lore and the doctor recommended ways of treating diseases and whatnot over the centuries were, I also found the mythology behind the creation of soap equally as fascinating. Now, there are a lot of myths out there. My most favorite probably is Mount Sapo, and that is suggested that that's where the term soap comes from. Now, what is Mount Sapo, you asked? Well, I'm glad you did. Let me show you. It doesn't exist. It's a myth. This is Roman lore that suggests there was this mountain that they would go to the top of and do animal sacrifices on top of, and then the fats and the drippings would come down and wash down with the rains, and the women that were at the river would find out that there were certain rocks that had this white substance on it that cleaned their clothing better than other rocks. Now, this logically makes sense that this is probably what did occur at some point that began, soap making and people starting to connect those dots. But as far as Mount Sapo and animalistic offerings up on top of this mountain, Mount Sapo does not seem to have existed anywhere. They cannot find in any historical records of Italy, Rome, and anything at the time. And two, that's not even how the Romans did animal sacrifices, because in order to get that much drippings washed down an entire mountain into a river, you would be sacrificing entire animals kind of en masse. And you didn't really do that with sacrifices back then. At least that's not what the documents show, because sacrificing, burning good meat that would feed, a culture, that's just bad for business. And so usually what they did was they would burn the bones or the entrails of these animals, and that was their form of sacrifice. So that also suggests that is not an accurate story of where soap came from. But just like with Aesop's fables, lore is lore and lore is fun, and you can still learn cool things from said lore. So that's a cool origin story for how soap began and also how soap was named. But realistically, the term soap, it's Germanic, which means Germanic languages, English, German, Scandinavian, you get it. And its etymology is really all we know about it. We don't actually know when soap was named soap, but it's one of those fascinating things, like trying to figure out where words come from. Always a good time. Now, another soap myth that I found that I really, really enjoyed involves the actual production of soap making and when it became sort of more commercialized and people were making it on a larger scale to sell and or barter with to the masses, as opposed to it becoming sort of like a household chore. It's time to go make soap. Like the Beverly Hillbillies and Granny with the pot. Like that, which is actually what soap has been for... I'm jumping ahead. But this particular myth involves the ruins of Pompeii. And we all know Pompeii, right? It's one of the world's most fascinating and well-preserved archaeological dig sites ever. And archaeologists are still working on Pompeii to this day, continuing to make new finds and discover new awesome things that really give us a picture of what these people's lives were back in, like the early ADs. For those of you who may not know what Pompeii is, first, it's not just a movie with Jon Snow in it, although I find that very humorous. It's a city that was at the base of a big mountain called Mount Vesuvius that turned out to be an active volcano that erupted and destroyed some 2,000 estimated people that lived within the city of Pompeii, which was about 13% of the population at the time, and completely preserved, I think, 2 cities, Pompeii and like Herculaneum, underneath the debris of the volcanic eruption. And I don't know who is dumb enough to live at the base of an active volcano. Now, Pompeii was destroyed and buried under the rubble again in 79 AD, and it wasn't until the end of the 16th century that archaeologists discovered some of the ruins and started to unearth them. And as I said, they are still making discoveries today. Side note, if you're interested in Pompeii, historical coolness, you should go check out the YouTube channel Absolute History. They have done several deep dives on Pompeii and what they've found there and all of the interesting sort of myths that have been debunked. Now, I'm talking about Pompeii because in the last, I don't know, maybe 30, 40 years, it has been rumored that in one of these archaeological digs, they unearthed a working, functioning soap shop, soap factory, complete with perfectly preserved bars of soap inside. Now, for somebody in the 21st century, maybe that's not that big of a deal, right? But because the very first records that we knew of an actual working soap shop did not actually exist until like the 8th century, 7th, 8th century, That's a big deal. Hundreds of years before, there was a fully functioning soap factory that had scented bars of soap inside. It's wild. And so that is an interesting myth that continues to go on, the interwebs and gets recirculated and all the jazz. But there have been multiple archaeologists that have worked on that project as well as within that soap factory area specifically. And every single one of them has stated, that's not a soap factory that we found. We think best case, this was a place to wash fish based on the fish scales that we found in the next room, all of the things. So probably not a soap factory, but it's kind of cool. Now, these are just a few examples of the many, many, many myths about soap making origins, and how long it's been around and what it's been used for that run rampant on the interwebs. And they're all fascinating. They're all a lot of fun, but they are all myths. Again, as far as we know, the most realistic version of the beginnings of the soap making world dates back to 2800 BCE in Babylon. Everything else, it's a lot of fun to think about, to talk about, to ponder, but probably not accurate as we don't have enough evidence to support it. Okay, so the history of soap making dates back to 2800 BCE, right? So for thousands of years, soap has existed. Like 5,000 years, it has existed. But for thousands of those 5,000s of years, it was not used regularly to cleanse the human body. And this is another weird misconception that I found on the interwebs and found to be really fascinating. And I think the reason why we make the association that, of course, ancient Romans or Egyptians or what have you were using soap regularly is because we have found a lot of documentation talking about their hygienic practices and what they would do to keep themselves clean. And us in a 21st century perspective, we equate that to, well, you washed with soap. But that's not really what they were doing. And again, one of the reasons they likely weren't doing that is because the soap itself was probably too caustic to be used on human skin without causing more problems. And so there were hygienic practices at play. It just really didn't involve soap. Soap, for the most part, for thousands of years was used to clean things, not people. And we'll talk about the ingredients and how those things evolved, later. But some of the interesting things during the time involving hygiene, I found to be very fascinating, and maybe you will too, because every civilization had ways of cleansing themselves, but it wasn't necessarily through soap. The ancient Romans and Egyptians, for example, would use exfoliating things like pumice or sand, and then they would scrape their bodies with sticks, and then they would slather their whole body with oil. All things we do today, but we also use soap. Ancient Germans, interestingly, used soap, but not to cleanse themselves. They used it to decorate their hair as a sort of pomade to, which I found super interesting, but that's again not related to soap actually being used to cleanse the body. I'm wondering what it was doing to the hair. And I know what you're thinking, but Mrs. Soap and Clay, bathhouses. Yeah, no, totally. Bathhouses have existed for thousands of years, for sure. Nobody is questioning that. This is found in all manner of archaeological digs. There have been some form of bathhouses that have existed across almost all civilizations for, again, thousands of years. But there's no indication that soap was ever used in these houses. And if you think about it, the writings that we have from those times describing the bathhouses and the process for being at the bathhouse, if soap was there, there would be at least one indication somewhere wherein they describe the water as foamy, like a bubble bath, right? We don't have any of that information. Therefore, we have to assume that bathhouses did not include soap. And also, bathhouses are one of the big reasons why disease continued to spread so easily, because they were dirty, nasty places. Now, people did take baths on their own, for sure, and with not group bathing necessarily. The Japanese, during the Middle Ages, for example, were well known for being rather fastidious with their cleaning rituals, and it did involve some version of water and bodies in it, but not in mass. And also not with soap. Another interesting bit of information that I found, the Vikings. So the Vikings, like late 700s, early thousands, the Vikings, they were accused of being overly concerned with hygiene because they would bathe once a week. And I find that interesting because whenever I think of Vikings, I think of, right? Don't you? Whatever. But yeah, no, they were actually also rather fastidious about their cleansing rituals in that they were bathing once a week, whereas the majority of the population in other areas of the world really were not, you know? And when I told Mr. Soap and Clay that the Vikings were, bathing once a week, he kind of did a little shudder and went, well, that's gross. You're only bathing once a week? And then I had to remind him that our grandparents legit did that. That's how close we are to that practice. Saturday night baths, everybody kind of uses the same, especially in the homestead life. Everybody uses like the same bath water, so it goes from oldest to youngest, and the youngest is left with all of the remains and dead skin cells and of all of the family members before. So, but with soap. Point is, hygiene was a thing. It just wasn't with soap. Bathing over the centuries was really like the modern day version of the fad diet, right? Just a lot of weird ideas about what you should do, what you could do if this lord had gout or a boil on his foot, and you should put some thyme and some rosemary into the bath water to like heal his ailments. Interestingly, we take those same things and we incorporate them into hair care, skin care, whatever today, because we have more knowledge base on it now. But back then, again, as I said, bathing and what you use to get clean, overall hygiene in general, it was like the modern day version of a fad diet. Eat all fat, eat no fat, eat all meat, eat all veggies, whatever. And just people would kind of go with the new trend until the next trend came about. So as I stated before, the early stages of soap were really made out of animal fats and, an ash solution, yielding a pretty viscous, very smelly, very dark, very probably not fun to have on your skin, caustic substance that still cleaned things. So that's basically what it was for quite a long time, and animal fats were primarily used in the very early stages. Now, it's interesting to talk about this today because in the 21st century, there seems to be a really big divide between animal fat soaps and vegetable fat soaps. And a lot of people seem to think that the vegan way is the better way. And a lot of people also seem to think that vegan soaps were sort of a newer, and by newer, I mean within the past, let's say 1,000 years, creation. And that's really not the case. Realistically, animal fat soaps and vegetable fat soaps were being created at around the same time throughout the history of soap. And really it all had to do with geography and what was around you, as well as what your culture allowed. So, for example, people in the southern hemisphere where you could grow abundant vegetable crops with really high yields, well, yeah, they were using those fats, those oils, to make their soaps. People in the northern hemisphere, where it was too cold to grow crops in any sort of sustainable yield, were using animal fats. And that's really where that divide began. But also with the cultural thing, there are some cultures that, of course, would not use a pig fat for a soap because they can't do that. And so they would move to vegetable oils as well. Since we're already on the subject of animal fat soaps versus vegetable fat soaps, I just want to talk about the Castile thing real quick because that's wild to me and a whole lot of fun. So, when we think olive oil soap, the very first thing that comes to mind for us now in the 21st century is a Castile soap. Castile region of Spain, right? And that dates back to what? The 11th century? So like the 1000s? And that's as far back as we can really date a Castile soap, and i.e. the other name for what we commonly know as a 100% olive oil soap or an olive oil soap in general. However, interestingly, Arab chemists in like the 600s were already making vegetable oil soaps, olive oil soaps in Nablus, Kufa, and Basra probably pronouncing all of those wrong. While France and Italy, which became known to be the two big hubs of the soap making industry as far as production goes, were still mostly using animal fats, usually goat fats, in their soap making. So the Arab Empire had already not only started making olive oil soaps in the 600s, but they also had factories. They were also scenting the bars, coloring the bars. They had full-scale operations going on. Yet they sort of get lifted out of the soap making equation, and they aren't given the credit that they kind of deserve. Instead, again, that credit goes to, as far as soap production, France and Italy, and as far as Castile soap production, Spain. And that didn't happen for at least 100 to 300 years after the Arab Empire had already figured it out. Wild. Now, as I said, France and Italy, they became very quickly the hubs of the soap manufacturing world. And by the 13th century, that is what they were known for, these two regions, one in France, one in Italy, Marseille and Savona. And they not only were making solid bar soap, they were also making like shave soaps and shampoo bars and laundry soaps, all the jazz. And for hundreds of years, they would continue to grow and expand and really kind of artistically enhance the soap making process in general. Now, this is all basically being done during the Middle Ages, right? Which is like something like 9 centuries long or some shit. Like, that's a long age. Side note, there are 3 ages. And if you know what they are without Googling, drop them in the comments, because I had to Google, I didn't know. There are only 3 ages, which I find weird. So what do we know about the Middle Ages? One of the things that we know the most about in regards to the Middle Ages is the plague. So I guess we have to talk about the elephant in the room. Now, this is an interesting thing to be talking about right now, considering we are living through a new plague. And as funny as it may be to, joke about that and say, the plague hit. No, that's what we're living through. And because of our advances in medicine and scientific knowledge, we are able to better combat the ramifications of a widespread disease that before would decimate entire populations. And so plagues have existed over the entirety of human civilization, and some plagues took out the entire population, and that's how the plague ended, because there was no one left to die. Other plagues, like the Black Plague, which started 1347-ish, and really didn't end until the Great Plague of London in 1665-ish, would continue to resurface every 10 years or so and take out large swaths of the population. Like the very beginning stages of the Black Plague, the Black Death, which we now know to be bubonic plague, it took out half of the world's population in the first 5 years, which is wild. And then it continued to move as, diseases do, usually fleas, rats. We know that now. They didn't know that then. And it would country hop on boats with the rats and the fleas and all of the things, and would continue to spread. And for 300 years, the Black Plague continued to ravage populations around the world, every 10 years or so, taking out about 20% of that area's population every time it resurfaced. And that's problematic. So in the Middle Ages, while soap is being made, kind of at a good large production scale, people were still dying in droves from the plague. Why? They really weren't using soap, is one of the reasons. So why did the Black Plague or the bubonic plague finally end? I mean, first, it really didn't. The bubonic plague is still very much a thing today. We know from recently, we had reports on squirrels having been studied and they're carrying the bubonic plague, and that's awful. But I guess we kind of know better now to stay away from things like squirrels and rats and other rodents and not let ourselves get bit by them, so we kind of steer clear. So there's that. So again, the bubonic plague, not really gone. It's still a thing. But why is it not decimating entire populations today the way that it did for hundreds of years, for thousands of years, arguably? Well, in the case of the bubonic plague and the Black Plague, the Great Fire of London actually helped. And for those of you that might not be familiar with the Great Fire of London, it was a big deal. And in the decimation of London by a fire, a lot of the infected rats and fleas were also killed, thus reducing the spread of the bubonic plague at that time. Third, over the course of 300 years, when the bubonic plague was first introduced into human civilization, we learned some things. One of the things we learned was to stay away from rats. 2, all civilizations continued to improve their methods of sewage systems and cleanliness things. And so like an example would be like a public lavatory in London, for example, that really basically consisted of a hole over the river, which is gross, but it's still wildly better than just taking your chamber pot and throwing it out into the road where all of the passerbys are walking. Gross. And so we started to improve as, civilizations continued to develop. We started to improve the way that we disposed of our waste. And so that also helped. If there aren't big piles of excrement and, human waste just hanging out in the street, or the dead bodies that they would just pile up after they would die of the plague, then rats have less reason to just be hanging out there, right? So less contact with the rats and the fleas that live on the rat, all of the things. And third, through those 300 years, another thing that we learned and started to be recommended all of the time by healthcare professionals was the daily use of soap. At this point, soap had been refined in such a way that while the formulation was still not super scientific, it was at a place where it could be used on the skin because we did have a milder version of, your fatty acids and your alkali. And so one of the reasons why the plague ended was people actually started bathing and washing their hands, washing their bodies with soap more regularly. Yet again, in the 21st century, COVID hit and WebMD has to remind us how to wash our hands. So how far have we really come? Also gross with all of that, like a complete side note, going to the 21st century now, that thing that came out a few weeks ago about like celebrities talking about how infrequently they bathe, like it's some sort of weird point of pride, especially in the middle of a pandemic, is just like weird flex. Not the point, Shantine. So really, soap during the Middle Ages is what a vaccine is today. A preventative measure that really slows the spread and the whatever of a disease that could take out huge swaths of the population. So they started using soap frequently, and people weren't getting as sick. Also, their skin was clearing up. Also, they didn't smell, so they didn't have to wear the little posy things to, sniff while they're walking around because it smells terrible and they smell terrible. The Middle Ages were wild. So from the 1600s on, soap was generally widely considered a thing that you should use on a daily basis to keep yourself clean. And it was still very much considered a household chore to make it. So it was definitely just part of what you did within your home. You need to make your own soap. And so for that reason, as I said, there wasn't a real good scientific formulation behind all of it. So you would end up with some bars that were kind of caustic and irritating to the skin, but it was still considered this to be wildly better than, dying from the plague. So people used soap that they mostly created inside of their homes. Production was a thing, but for the most part, the people that bought soap were the rich, were the elite, were the upper class that could afford such a luxury of having someone else make their soap for them. Now, why and how did we get from kind of caustic bars of soap that we all have to make at home and we really don't know what we're doing to soap as we know it today? Enter the creation of lye. In 1791, Nicolas Leblanc of France patented the first method of making sodium carbonate, soda ash, from salt, thus making the big and first most important scientific advancement in the creation of soap. It's making it safer. Because when you make things more scientific, you can then measure it. Now, with this discovery, it made the soap making industry one of the fastest growing industries for the next 100 years, which means it was exploited, taxed, and consumerized because consumerism. So soap became a toiletry item that the haves had and the have-nots wanted but couldn't afford it. It was taxed like crazy. It was very much restricted. It was overpriced. And so they continued, the have-nots continued to make soap as they always had done. But now, because we had some metrics to gauge off of, their soap became milder and safer and less harsh on the skin. In 1811, Michel Chevreul discovered and outlined the relationship between fatty acids and an alkali salt, thus really creating the first knowledge base of the relationship between the components that make soap what it is today, thus expanding the scientific base. So really it was the 17th century when soap and better hygiene practices became more commonplace, and not really until the 18th century that we had a more scientific measurement on how soap is made, how it can be safely made, and how we can therefore start building recipes. So the 18th century, that's where us as soap makers in the 21st century really trace back to. Crazy, not that long ago, considering soap's been around for like 5,000 years. One of the other really important advancements in the soap making world came in the early 1900s when a German scientist produced and created the first synthetic detergent, the first artificial surfactant that was used to start making soaps that we know soaps to be from, early 1900s until we all started going, oh no, we're going back to handmade soaps like in the last 40 years or so. The Syndet bars. Now, the reason behind this invention and why it's so influential and why, therefore, Syndet bars do have a very important place in our world even today is simple. It was World War I, and the availability of edible fats, those with which you would use to make soaps, were scarce across the world. And so in order to keep people clean and not dying from disease while a world war was killing large swaths of populations for other reasons, and then the Second World War, all of the things, rations, but they needed to find another way to make soap so people could continue to get clean. So this creation brought about, again, Syndet bars, and people were able to continue living their lives and bathing and staying clean and reasonably free from illnesses that could, kill them. Now, while that started as a good thing because needs must during a world war scenario, it ultimately ended up becoming the bane of our skin's existence in different kind of unforeseen ways. And it's something that the natural soap making community, I say natural in this meaning going back to basics, your oils and your lye solution without synthetics. We're not getting into a natural debate today. While that was important and good at the time, the unforeseen consequence of Syndet bars were that they were actually pretty harsh on the skin. Yes, they got you clean. And no, most people didn't end up with huge skin sensitivities surrounding it, although that is definitely a consideration today. It also overly dried your skin. It also caused premature aging. So to the point where dermatologists over the past 50 years or whatnot have been telling people, don't use soap on your face. Now dermatologists are walking that back. Dermatologists and estheticians are walking that back and saying, no, don't use detergent bars on your face. This other thing is actually okay. But the reason why they're walking that back, and the thing that we are fighting against as natural soap makers, as artisan soap makers, is this perception that soap is drying to the skin, that soap is, because it was commercialized, because it was consumerized, because big companies were manufacturing on the cheap synthetic detergent bars that in fact dried people's skin out, that in fact did cause premature aging, that in fact were not as good as the thing that we make now. We're fighting against that whenever we come in contact with anybody when we're trying to sell our wares. Oh no, soap is too drying. I really need a moisturizing bar. What can you give me? And also I think within that, we're fighting against that knowledge base within the formulation of our own recipes. The number of times people have asked me, how do you make a moisturizing bar of soap? Does this recipe look good, or is it going to be too drying? Probably not. Just by nature of removing those synthetic detergents and going back to basics and going with your fatty acids, and your alkali solution, as long as it's a well-formulated recipe, and you know how to formulate a recipe these days, and if you don't, there are tons of soap calcs out there that can help you. It's already going to be wildly better for your skin than any detergent bar that exists on the market today. So again, the creation of the detergent bar is important for the time, but unfortunately 100 years later, something that we're having to fight against within the new natural soap making movement. So I find that very interesting because we are working against a knowledge base that essentially commercials told us, companies told us, our parents told us, these are the things that you should use to keep yourself clean and healthy and all the jazz. And we're trying to say, yeah, no, that's right. Like definitely soap and the bubbles and all of that, it breaks down, the things around bacteria. But this over here is going to be better for your skin. And it's hard to push back against that as a small business artisan soap maker. So every day is a challenge for all of us. And that's why. But it was also during this period that soap stopped being taxed at such a high rate, thus making it actually more widely available to the masses, which is a great thing. But when Ivory's selling their soap for 10 cents a bar or whatever, now it's like $2 a bar. And we're selling ours for 7, 8, 9, 10. Because it's better, because it's longer lasting, because it does better things for your skin, it still becomes problematic with or without the tax relief that we no longer have to, suffer with when selling our soaps. Okay, now for the wrap up. What does it all mean? The whole history of soap goes back as far as we know to 2800 BCE in Babylon. And so for thousands of years, the knowledge base for making soap has existed. For thousands of years, people were not using soap to cleanse their body. Although even the gross tar-like smelly substances that they were using to clean wools and textiles and cooking utensils still effectively cleansed, it wasn't being widely used to actually cleanse human skin for the reasons that we've talked about. Caustic soaps. The origins of soap making, kind of confusing, kind of a big unknown. We have some pieces, but realistically, one of the reasons why we have so few pieces and we don't really have it completely categorized and documented down to the most minute of detail is because it's soap. It's easily one of the most boring things that exist on the planet. And today we see it as such because it is commonplace for us to use soap several times a day. And so therefore, who cares where it came from? I do, and that's why I did this video. And I find it interesting that because of the advances in science and civilization and the human brain and all of the things over the past several centuries, we now have soap down to such a beautiful science that it is easy and commonplace and not a difficult thing at all to do. We still fight about the right way to make soap. Because in all honesty, for thousands of years, people were making soap in all manner of crazy ways. And there has never been a documented case of soap killing someone, causing them great harm. So I find it interesting that we continue to kind of bicker over the right way to make soap, the wrong way to make soap, what you can do, what you can't do, what you should always do, what you should never do. When what we do have are examples of thousands of years of people just kind of doing whatever they wanted, and soap still basically became soap. Granted, we make better soap today because science. But maybe we can stop, I don't know, attacking other soap makers because you don't feel that they're doing it right because they use tallow. Or you don't feel that they're doing it right because they use palm oil. Whatever. Soap is soap, and if you formulate the recipe right, which we all know how to do, it's going to become soap and it's going to be beneficial to your life and not something that can harm you. So that's it. The crazy, dirty, wild, long history of soap making, all the questions, all of the myths, all of the fun, all in one long video that's 3 hours worth of footage right now. Great. Gonna love editing this. Yeah, with these deep dives, I really do want to be exploring more things kind of like this, more in depth, reasonably regularly. I'm thinking, like deep dives into, coconut oil and the history and its uses and all of the things, the things that we put into soap and, really breaking down the chemistry behind it as well. I'm personally interested in that. I like the research. I like the deep dives. If you guys are interested in that, let me know in the comments, and hopefully be able to continue on with these deep dives, because even with this editing process, this is still a lot of fun. I like being able to talk with like-minded people who care about things like soap, because I don't really have that in my daily life. Like, people don't. Mr. Soap and Clay does not care about the history of soap at all, but I think maybe you do. So if you do, let me know in the comments below. I am so glad that you guys joined me for another round of 365 days of soap. It's kind of rough starts with the deep dives because, it's a new process. I'll get into the groove soon enough for sure. But again, if you are interested in more of the deep dive stuff, comment below, subscribe, become a sudser. For my sudsers, thank you for being here. As always, you are appreciated. I'm going to go because it's now 8:30 in the morning, and I started this at 5:30, and I need coffee, and I need to get to editing this video. So I'm out of here for today, but I will see you guys all again tomorrow for another round of soapy fun. Bye.